President Trump hoping to turn the page after a turbulent week of backlash over his response to the Charlottesville violence. Much of that criticism coming this morning from inside his own party.
As we look to the future, it's going to be very difficult for this president to lead if, in fact, moral authority remains compromised.
You know, blaming one side or another when we're talking about the KKK or white supremacists, there is no comparison between hate groups and everybody else.
Those were just two Republicans you were hearing from. And now, as the president returns from his working vacation and prepares for a campaign-style rally on Tuesday in Phoenix, Arizona, a brand new poll shows that his approval numbers in 3 states that he won have now fallen below 40%. This as North Korea issues a new nuclear threat to the U.S. The rogue nation says that it is now ready to, quote, mercilessly strike as it accuses the, quote, reckless U.S. of driving the two countries to the brink of nuclear war. We'll have more on that in just a minute. But first, we begin in Bedminster, New Jersey, where the president is spending the final hours of that working vacation. CNN's Boris Sanchez nearby in Bridgewater. Boris, the president returning to the White House. He will not be there for long, though.
That's right, Jim. The president's 17-day working vacation to Bedminster, New Jersey wraps up today. He's heading back to Washington, D.C. tonight, but as you said, he is heading to Arizona this week. On Tuesday, he is going to take part in some kind of tour in Yuma. We don't have clarity on specifically what he will be touring, but we know that later that night, he is going to head to Phoenix for a rally. And the White House has been reeling, as you said, Jim, from the president's press conference last Tuesday that received harsh criticism from both sides of the aisle. Many in his own party are now urging the president to be more inclusive in his language, and specifically at this rally on Phoenix, some want to see him take a much more conciliatory tone. One of the president's critics, John Kasich, the governor of Ohio, was on State of the Union this morning with Jake Tapper. Listen to what he said.
The president is our president. We want him to be successful. People around him have to get to him, including his own family, to say, okay, you need to show leadership. You need to bring the country together. You're going to go to Phoenix and make a speech, fine. That's your right. You can go there. He's got free speech just like the rest of us have it. But when you go, try to use that as an opportunity to say something that's going to bring people together.
Now, some have actually gone further than that, Jim, including the mayor of Phoenix. You know, over the past several days, there's been speculation that the president might use this rally as an occasion to pardon Sheriff Joe Arpaio, who's been heavily criticized across the country for racial profiling in the state of Arizona. The president himself said that it was something he was considering. Here's a statement from the mayor of Phoenix, Greg Stanton, who writes, quote, if President Trump is coming to Phoenix to announce a pardon for former Sheriff Joe Arpaio, then it will be clear that his true intent is to inflame emotions and further divide our nation. It is my hope that more sound judgment prevails and that he delays his visit. Jim, we've received no indication so far from the White House that the president has any intention of delaying this visit. No indication yet as to whether or not he may end up pardoning Sheriff Arpaio. Jim?
Boris Chan says they're traveling with the president. President Trump faced his fair share of heat, as we've said this week, over his response to the Charlottesville violence. And as we said, it wasn't just Democrats, Republicans adding their voices to the chorus of criticism, too. This morning, several lawmakers said their word on the Sunday shows.
Where I want to look now is what are we going to do to deal with the fundamental issues that we have in the country, the issue of race, the issue of police and community coming together and developing policing methods that can unify.
You know, anyone that's committing violence ought to be condemned. Anyone. There's no justification for it whatsoever. And we can't allow the commander-in-chief to somehow equate the handful of people that would make those protests violent with any kind of sentiment that condones white supremacy or neo-Nazism.
Well, I think what he said on Monday was fantastic. It would have been even better had he said it on Saturday. What he said on Tuesday was just really challenging. What the president should do before he says something is to sit down and become better acquainted have a personal connection to the painful history of racism and bigotry of this country.
It is not just fellow politicians who are disappointed in how the president is handling his job today. A new poll of Rust Belt states that helped push President Trump into the White House show that his approval numbers are dropping to new lows, and this is key, below the 40% mark. The new NBC News Marist poll surveyed voters in 3 states that Trump won in 2016, key states. In Michigan, 36% of adults approve of his job performance. In Pennsylvania, just 33%. Same in Wisconsin. Of course, you remember what a key role those states played in his election win. All of them surprises, really, taking them away from Hillary Clinton, the Democrat. Let's discuss this now with our panel. Julian Zelizer is a CNN political analyst. He's also a historian at Princeton University. Tanzina Vega is CNN's race and inequality reporter. And Andre Brower is the former lieutenant governor of South Carolina, Trump supporter as well. Julian, I want to start with you as we look at these numbers. This poll, we should mention, was conducted after the violence, the unrest in Charlottesville. We're just 7 months into the president's term, and yet we're 3.5 years nearly from the next presidential election. How key are these approval numbers right now, today?
Well, they're important because Republicans are not looking at 2020. Politically, they're looking at 2018. And they're trying to figure out what impact might this have on the midterms. And some Republicans are also trying to figure out what impact do the statements from that press conference and other statements that he has made have on the reputation and image of the GOP more broadly. So I think the poll numbers are significant, even if they come very early in the presidency.
Andre Brower, do you sense nervousness within Trump's team? Do you look at these numbers and see concern about 2018 as well as 2020?
Well, I don't know that you immediately see concern. You'd always rather have your poll numbers better than going in the opposite direction. But more than anything, what's important to me is when I supported Donald Trump, I wanted to see somebody come in and make substantial change. What he's got to do more than anything right now is he's got to make sure that he works with members of Congress. And so if they get down on him and he can't get his agenda passed, that's where the real problem lies. If he can get people back to work, if he can continue to make people's lives better, a lot of this other stuff will go away. But one of the strong suits in my 14 years in the General Assembly and Lieutenant Governor was I made big friends with certain groups. The Black Caucus was one of my best groups to work with when I needed things passed, and I would come off the podium and talk to them. He's got to have core groups of supporters, not just Republicans, that will work with him to get his agenda passed, and that's going to be key more than right now battleground states. But people like Kid Rock, who are ultimately thinking about making a Senate run, when they see these numbers go down, that may discourage him from running. So those are important in secondary aspects of what the president wants to try to get done.
Do you see the president doing the opposite of the advice that you just gave him there, Andre? You talk about reaching out. I mean, for one, he's attacking his own Republican colleagues, as you know, Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, but also certainly not building bridges with, for instance, minority voters in terms of his handling of Charlottesville. Does that concern you in particular or most immediately for his agenda?
Donald Trump is a brilliant guy, and he does a lot of things that are not what we would all expect. He's had a good week and a bad week. But I would say this, in 2000, Donald Trump didn't do real well in the real estate market, but he learned substantially from that and the licks he took, and he talked about it. In 2008, when a lot of people are suffering, he was able to turn his business, what he had learned from failing times, and really capitalize on a bad market. And so I hope the bad times he had this past week, he'll learn from those and capitalize on an opportunity to unite this country, unite the two parties to try to work together on common things like a dialogue. I thought John Kasich was so good this morning, talking about making sure that the people that felt like they were downtrodden had a piece of the pie, that we worked together for goodwill. And John Kasich did an excellent job this morning on conveying what I thought was a conservative message, but a message that all of us feel the hurt. All of us want to see people do better, and all of us want to make sure that nobody feels like that the Republican Party supports the KKK or these hate groups, because we don't.
Tanzina, I want to ask you, because Senator Tim Scott, in addition to Governor John Kasich, added his voice to the chorus of GOP criticism of President Trump's handling of Charlottesville. I want to play his sound again on State of the Union this morning. He had some very strong words, and get your reaction.
As we look to the future, it's going to be very difficult for this president to lead if, in fact, that moral authority remains compromised.
That's a Republican senator there, Tanzina, saying that the president's moral authority is compromised. How damaging is that for, I mean, particularly in the African-American community, but beyond that as well?
I think that you're seeing some really significant comments coming out of this past week, particularly from people in the GOP. You know, after the last election, not this past election, but the last election of President Obama, the GOP had to really do an analysis and came out actually with a report saying how much they needed to get better at connecting with and communicating with communities of color, women voters, et cetera, and marginalized communities. And I think what we've seen is they've gone the opposite way. They zigged instead of zagging. And so, and in addition to that, you're also seeing that the president himself is inconsistent on his messaging when it comes to this. You know, we get a late response, then we get what some people are saying is a decent response, and then we get, you know, the press conference on Tuesday. And so I think we have to take Americans' intelligence pretty seriously and understand that it's a little bit insulting to assume that, you know, we can just sort of pivot back and forth on issues that are so fundamental to American democracy and society. And racism is one of those issues. People have memories, right? And emotional issues are the ones that tend to stick. Julian, I want to ask you this, though, because after the 2016 election, there was criticism of the Democratic Party, of the standard bearer Hillary Clinton, but also other candidates, the strategy and criticism from within the party for going too far, leaning too heavily on identity politics. Do you see a danger here of overemphasizing, if that's the right word, just purely from a politically strategic perspective? I mean, you even heard Steve Bannon in one of his quote-unquote exit interviews this week saying that the Republicans would benefit, in his view, if the Democrats went entirely down that path. Do you see dangers there?
Maybe, but I don't think the Democrats want to listen to Stephen Bannon for advice. I think...
But it's not just, to be clear, it's not just Stephen Bannon who gave that criticism. After 2016, you heard that from Democrats as well.
Yeah, but I think what this week revealed is some of those issues that are often characterized or even dismissed as identity politics are often social rights politics. It's about racial equality, about gender equality. It's about the rights of immigrants, ideas that have been really at the core of democratic politics since the 1960s. And I'm not sure the right kind of move is for Democrats to abandon those or even to dismiss those. It's true they have to pay more attention to the economy. It's true they have to look at how many middle-class Americans feel insecure. But I think they are onto some values that have been pretty important. And this week revealed why, when the president moved in the wrong direction addressing what happened in.
Also, if I could jump in there for 1 second.
Please jump in. It'll be the final word because we're running short of time. The phrase
identity politics is often used to describe only when we're talking about communities of color and marginalized communities. This election cycle, this administration, and Stephen Bannon in particular have relied very heavily on white identity politics. And so we need to sort of examine what we're saying when we're talking about whose country we're taking back, and all of these other sort of euphemisms that were used throughout the campaign and beyond.
How about American identity politics? Maybe we could agree on that. Julian, Andre, Tanzina, thanks so much for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up, a sharp new warning from North Korea, right as the U.S. prepares for military exercises in South Korea, just across the border. This comes as one former presidential candidate says it is time to take out the rogue nation's missile systems. Details right after this.
CNN Newsroom, brought to you by Kind Snacks. Ingredients you can see and pronounce. Give Kind a try.
People confuse nice and kind, but they're different. It's nice to remove artificial ingredients. Kind never had to. We choose real ingredients like almonds, peanuts, and...
Was this a PR move by James Murdoch? He's the CEO of 21st Century Fox. He's a son of Rupert Murdoch. He wrote a letter this week that said in part, "What we watched in Charlottesville and the reaction to it by the President of the United States concerns all of us as Americans and free people." Now, James Murdoch didn't stop there. He kept going. He said, "To further demonstrate our commitment, my wife Catherine and I are donating $1 million to the Anti-Defamation League. And I encourage you," he said to colleagues, "to give what you think is right as well." Now, James Murdoch said that his business, 21st Century Fox, has tried to contribute to a diverse and tolerant society. Some folks who think Fox News has an adverse effect on society cracked up at that sentence. What does James Murdoch mean when he's donating $1 million to the ADL? Does it tell us anything about Fox News? Back with me, Tanzina Vega and Nicole Hannah-Jones. I wonder, Tanzina, your interpretation of this. I mean, what viewers of Fox News, loyal viewers of Fox, are hearing about Charlottesville and about the president's reaction is very different than what's been heard in the rest of the press.
So I think there's two things to think about here. Number one, we're seeing a lot more corporate involvement and corporate condemnation of this president and of everything that the comments that he made and the lack of
this was James
response.
Murdoch's way of doing that,
That's
right?
That's right. So we've seen companies pulling out. We've seen all of this. So this is another, step in that equation. I think what's interesting is that obviously Fox is underneath that. I think what's interesting would be to ask journalists of color working at Fox how they take this, journalists that are from, different groups that are working at this organization, what's happening behind the scenes there. I think it sends a very strong message, but obviously we want to see, does that trickle down to the content?
There is a significant discrimination suit against Fox that's pending right now. We also heard from the CEO of Univision this week, another media company, in this case, Randy Falco, the head of Univision, making a pretty big stand against the president. I think in that case, speaking on behalf of Hispanic viewers of Univision, Spanish-speaking viewers in the United States. Nicole, do you think that it's appropriate to see media CEOs weighing in like that? We've seen a lot of CEOs speaking out, but media CEOs takes it to a different place.
Yeah, I don't know that I have an opinion on that I'm going to express. I think that...
It's an unusual answer on cable news, and I actually really appreciate that.
I think in general, we are brought up not to, as journalists, not to tell our viewers or our readers our opinions, and I think in general that's a good practice, but I'm not going to comment on that.
But when does that change? I mean, Jake Tapper has said something recently that stood out to me. He said, yes, we keep our opinions in many cases to ourselves, but on issues of decency and facts, that's when journalists have to speak out.
Well, and I agree, and I think that's the difference. When we're talking about what this president has said and done, that's exactly the reporting that Carl Bernstein was referring to earlier in the show, right? We're doing reporting based on what he says, and we're doing reporting based on what he doesn't say, and we're doing reporting based on his policies. So anybody that's been following the policies of the administration can tell you, not just the rhetoric, but the actual policies that are being implemented or that are attempting to be implemented, the Muslim ban, the language around Mexican immigrants, the language around criminal aliens. So like all of this is leading up to actual reporting and taking away what this president means.
More stories to tell. Thank you to both for being here. We're out of time on TV, but we continue on ReliableSources.com. Sign up for our nightly newsletter there. All the day's media news emailed to you every night. Sign up at ReliableSources.com. I'll see you right back here next week. Welcome back to Reliable Sources. President Trump's chief strategist, Steve Bannon, was always something of a mystery, which is partly why SNL was able to depict him as, I'm sure you remember, the Grim Reaper. Now, Bannon loved that. He wanted that evil Darth Vader kind of persona out there. But he's actually quite chummy with reporters, and that's continued even now that he's been forced out of the White House. He's back at the helm of Breitbart News, and President Trump has weighed in on that this weekend, saying it's great because fake news needs the competition. In one of his recent interviews, Bannon told the Weekly Standard that I feel jacked up. Now I'm free. I've got my hands back on my weapons. Someone said it's Bannon the Barbarian. So think about that. When he says he's got his hands back on his weapons, he's talking about Breitbart. He's talking about his media company as being his weapons, not as his journalistic force for good, but as his weapons. Well, join me now to discuss all of this. Jonathan Lemire is back, the AP's White House correspondent, and Joshua Green is here, CNN political analyst, also the author of the best-timed book of the year, Devil's Bargain, all about Steve Bannon and Donald Trump and the campaign. So, Joshua, what do you think? What is Bannon talking about when he says he has his hands back on his weapons? What does that tell us about him?
Well, it tells us that he thinks he can use Breitbart News, that outlet, as a weapon in the political wars in the same way that, frankly, they did before he went into the Trump administration. Breitbart is an outlet with a distinct political worldview that it pushes and its story choice and who it tends to go after in the kind of stories it reports about. Yeah. It has a real effect on the culture, and we know now that there are certain things that Bannon wants to do in the world that he wasn't able to do from inside the White House. Now he can try and push those same policy arguments from outside, from Breitbart.
Is Breitbart big enough for him, or do you believe some of the reports out there that he's interested in launching some sort of television network?
This is something that had been discussed in the closing days of the campaign. The fact that Trump had this list of 12 to 14 million small donors who are intensely loyal to him and could be built into an audience. I certainly think it's a possibility. The interesting thing to me, though, is Bannon has always said that TV is not where it's at. This rising generation of populist Republicans.
Hey, we're on CNN here.
This is what he says, that they are internet-based, and that that Fox News is for old geriatric conservatives, and that the rising generation of populist conservatives were more web-focused. Now, maybe that now that he's been in and out of the White House, he does have a broader vision that could encapsulate some sort of TV presence. But he told me when we did an interview just after he was fired or removed on Friday, that he was looking to go global. So he is going to grow Breitbart News in some way, shape, or form. It's just not clear yet what that medium is going to be.
And John, what does Bannon's removal from the White House mean for the White House and for the press corps? I don't think I'm giving away any secrets by saying he was a source for a lot of reporters. You didn't see him quoted on the record very often, but he would talk to reporters on background. Are we going to see less leaks out of the White House?
It's possible. Certainly the president in recent days became of the belief that Steve Bannon was among the leakers in the White House. Certainly, yes, until this rash of on-the-record interviews in recent days, including one that may or may not have been intentional. He would rarely be quoted by name, but he would certainly have his fingerprints on certain stories. He would contribute to them. I think in the White House right now, there's a little bit of, in certain quarters of the White House, some nervousness as to how this will play out. I mean, it's not just that Steve Bannon is going to go after Democrats and establishment Republicans like Paul Ryan, like he always has, as the head of Breitbart. There's a suggestion that some of his enemies in the White House could come under scrutiny from the Breitbart forces. This could be Jared Kushner or Gary Cohn. There's a belief that he will be reluctant to take on the president by name, at least for a while, but he has said that he is going to push the White House to fulfill the campaign promises.
But do we make too much of Bannon's power? I mean, if he had been that successful, Joshua, wouldn't he still be at the White House?
That's a fair point. And it is just a fact that you have more power working inside the White House to affect policy directly than you do working outside the White House. However, Breitbart really was a powerful force in politics while Steve Bannon was at the helm. They really did drive the debate in the Republican Party, not just through Breitbart, but because there's a whole infrastructure of conservative talk radio and websites that seem to move in the same direction. That stopped more or less when Bannon went into the White House because the association with Breitbart was actually problematic for him. When they would attack Kushner or somebody in the White House, Bannon came under attack from Trump himself. And so now that he is uninhibited and can push whatever argument he wants publicly, it could well be that he has more influence in shaping the public debate and putting pressure on the administration than he did when he was in a room with Trump and other advisors.
That's interesting. John, briefly on Hope Hicks, now the interim communications director. There's been a guessing game about who would take that job. What does it mean that there's now an interim communications director? Does it matter?
Well, first of all, it means that Hope Hicks is pretty much bulletproof, at least to this point in this Trump White House. She has been one of the original members. She has been there smartly, stayed out of the spotlight.
Never done a TV interview.
That's right. She used to work for Ivanka Trump. She was part of the original core with the president. She has been extremely loyal. The president respects her.
But does it mean that he can't find an outsider who's willing to come on board and run his comms?
They have certainly had a lot of trouble finding people in the past. I think there is a suggestion they are still going to look for a permanent person. Hope Hicks will certainly still wield influence in that White House. She is often at the president's side. There have been moments in his Oval Office interview with the Times a few weeks back. She was the only aide in the room. So she is going to be someone. She is going to, whether she holds this title of communications director or not, it's unclear whether she wants it full time. She is going to have influence in this White House.
John, Joshua, thank you so much for being here.
Sure thing.
And up next, the aftermath of Charlottesville. Is cable news coverage missing the mark?
And these are the lawns.
Welcome back to Reliable Sources. I'm Brian Stelter. Tuesday was supposed to be about infrastructure. That's how President Trump began his remarks in the lobby of Trump Tower. His aides were not expecting him to take questions, but he felt unfairly attacked by the news media for his initial responses to Charlottesville, so he attacked back. Now, here's what you didn't see at the time. This is what it looked like from CNN correspondent Jim Acosta's perspective.
You had some very bad people in that group, but you also had people that were very fine people on both sides. You had people.
No, sir, the Nazis, there are no fine people in the Nazis.
Now, you know the rest. Since then, since that impromptu presser, Trump has not answered a single question from the press corps, and White House spokespeople have not gone on TV. Relative silence, except of course, for the president's Twitter feed. But tonight, Trump will return to the White House from vacation, and it's anybody's guess what will happen next. Our panel is standing by for more on the fate of the Trump presidency, but first, let me bring in Jonathan Lemire, a White House correspondent for the Associated Press. John, you were there for all of it this week. The Saturday initial response to Charlottesville, Monday's cleanup attempt, Tuesday's presser. What did you learn about the president and his approach with the media?
Yeah, it was remarkable to how we got to that moment, and it's helpful to look back. First, we had a couple days at Bedminster at his golf club, where he took over 50 questions in 2 days. He hadn't answered a question from the media in ages, and we got him repeatedly. He seemed to be seeking out questions.
He seemed to love it.
Making eye contact with reporters, saying, come on, bring me another one, bring another one. Then Charlottesville happens. We're still at Bedminster. He's in his golf club. He gives his statement. He walks off. I and other reporters there are shouting questions about his relationship with white nationals, whether he renounces their support, whether he considered it was terrorism. He didn't answer.
Right.
Monday, of course, is in the White House. We know that behind the scenes, he was very happy with his first statement on Saturday. He felt that he had addressed this situation comprehensively. He truly believed there were instigators on both sides of that clash. But aides convinced him he needed to go to the White House and more firmly and explicitly denounce white supremacists, which he did. But then Tuesday morning, we saw it boil out from him in Trump Tower. Even though he had signed off on a plan from aides that he was just going to come down, talk about infrastructure and nothing else, instead, he finished his statement and proceeded to combat with the press corps. And you could see him there. I mean, he got very agitated very quickly. He was denouncing reporters. The video with Jim Acosta is a good example, but it was others. He just repeatedly pressed his point and left many on the sidelines, White House aides. There's that famous already photo of John Kelly with his arms crossed, staring at his shoes. Right. But it was more than him. Sarah Sanders, his press secretary, was wildly looking around the room, trying to make eye contact with people. I saw one.
Why do you think Sarah was doing that?
I think because if he had gone off according to he had broken from the plan, and she was trying to figure out, like, is this something that we could try to rein in? Should we stop this? What should we do now? There was even one young aide who her mouth literally dropped as the president kept talking.
Dropped at what point? Do you remember?
It was late. It was when I think he had third or fourth time suggested that there was responsibility on both sides. That I think there was a sense of some surprise from his staff who had signed off on the statement before in which he had made the explicit denunciation of white supremacists. Some surprise he had gone back to this issue publicly.
What do you make of the silence from the White House since?
I think they recognized two things. First of all, the president spoke from his heart. This is what he believes, and there's a reluctance to contradict him publicly. Secondly, there's also recognition that this is a tough moment for this White House. There are aides there who, this is what always seems to happen, right? When the president says something perhaps controversial, aides off the record talk to reporters, say they're dismayed or disgruntled, but yet no one has been willing to publicly say that they disagree with the president, and certainly no one has taken a step to resign.
Let's go to our panel and bring them back as well. To Douglas Brinkley, when we think about a situation like this, are there precedents for it? Had you ever seen a presidential press conference like this?
No, there's nothing like it. I mean, there's the famous one when Richard Nixon had to say, "I'm not a crook," and our Jim Acosta at CNN is a little bit of the goading Dan Rather, trying to get at a president. But for Donald Trump to be backing neo-Nazis and to have Jim Acosta, he should be in the book of Bartlett's Book of Quotations. There are no fine Nazis. I mean, Donald Trump is seeming to be backing neo-Nazis with no understanding of what we did in World War II and what the horror of fascism and the Nazis are. It was a jaw-dropping, stunning moment never seen in American history.
Carl, is there a risk of an overreaction from the press here, though? You know, the Access Hollywood tape came out in October. A lot of journalists wrote off Trump's chances, and now he's in the White House. Is there a risk of an overreaction to this week?
Not if we do our reporting and see that as our real function and not doing opinion pieces as our primary function. Look, there are plenty of commentators who do opinion pieces. I'm talking about reporting. I'm going to look at a quote right here from one of these Republicans I talked to last week who said, the fundamental problem is we have a president of the United States who does not know right from wrong and who is not stable. That's the kind of thing that we're talking about here. But also, we keep hearing about these military leaders keeping the president from doing dangerous things. And I would say, as somebody who spent 50 years as a reporter around Washington, that this is an unprecedented situation, a dangerous situation such as we've never seen for an extended period of time. We had Nixon in the last days in the White House. Yes, he was a bit unstable perhaps then, but understandably, given the circumstances of him having to leave office, this is different. It's ongoing. And I would say that if we are dependent on the military leaders of this country, 4 or 5 of them, to protect us from the President of the United States, then that too is a story. And part of that story is it time then for the President to be urged to leave office by those in his party and perhaps those same military leaders who understand the dynamic at work here? And there's also the question of these people in the White House. When do they become collaborators as opposed, particularly with what the President has been advocating, collaborators rather than people who simply are trying to push him in a good direction?
Alice, all this talk about military leaders, some foreign correspondents writing about the United States from other countries would bring up the word coup, a soft coup, with all this talk of military leaders intervening.
Well, that has been discussed, and some people wonder what happened at Camp David over the last few days and whether or not that was sort of an intervention. But let me just say this. While, yes, there has been nonstop coverage on what happened in Charlottesville and the President's response to this, and so many in the media are focused on what he said in his first and his third response to this, where he placed saying there's blame on both sides and in essence a moral equivalency by those that protesting and the ones standing up to them. But what his base and what many Republicans are hearing is he did denounce the Ku Klux Klan. He did denounce neo-Nazism and white supremacists, and that is what his base, and that is what Republicans, more conservative news outlets are stressing the fact he denounced these hate actions, and he went out of his way to make sure and fact-checked exactly what happened before he went out there and made a statement. So while I think so much focus is put on what he said with regard to sharing the blame, many in his base and more conservative journalists are covering the fact that he denounced it, and that is the only takeaway that his supporters are having from this coverage. Yeah, the takeaway is that the press, the media, is never satisfied. To our panel, thank you very much for being here. After the break, Steve Bannon gone, but definitely not forgotten. Bannon out of the Oval Office, but says he still has the president's back. So what does that mean for the conservative media landscape? Bannon biographer Joshua Green joins me next. Hey, I'm Brian Stelter. Welcome to our viewers in the United States and around the world. This is Reliable Sources, our weekly program about the media. Now, this was not a normal week, so this is not a normal show. President Trump's actions and inactions in the wake of Charlottesville are provoking some uncomfortable conversations, mostly off the air, if we're being honest. In discussions among friends and family and debates on social media, people are questioning the president's fitness. But these conversations are happening in newsrooms and TV studios as well. Usually after the microphones are off or after the stories are filed, after the paper's been put to bed, people's concerns and fears and questions come out. Questions that often feel out of bounds, off limits, too hot for TV. Questions like these. Is the President of the United States a racist? Is he suffering from some kind of illness? Is he fit for office? And if he's unfit, then what? These are upsetting, polarizing questions. They're uncomfortable to ask. But we in the national news media can't pretend like our readers and viewers aren't already asking. They are asking. This is how deep the country's divide has really become. My impression is that since President Trump's inauguration, there's been a lot of tiptoeing going on. His actions have been described as unpresidential, as unhinged, and sometimes even crazy. Now, that word crazy can be interpreted several different ways. It gets said a lot more in private than it gets said on TV. For instance, this next soundbite was never meant to be heard on TV at all. Last month, Republican Senator Susan Collins was overheard on a hot mic saying that Trump's handling of spending was incredibly irresponsible. Democratic Senator Jack Reed responded by saying he thinks Trump is crazy.
I think he's crazy. I mean, I don't don't say that lightly and as a kind of, a goofy guy.
This week, Republican Senator Bob Corker questioned the president's stability. Watch.
The president has not yet been able to demonstrate the stability nor some of the competence that he needs to demonstrate in order to be successful.
Now, some Democrats, not surprisingly, have gone a lot further. California Democrat Zoe Lofgren asked if Trump has early-stage dementia. She said she wants a mental exam conducted. Another California Dem, Jackie Speer, called for Trump's removal under the 25th Amendment. And Al Gore said Trump should resign. We're also hearing this in some liberal corners of the news media and the entertainment world. You saw Late Night Comics got very serious this week. Jimmy Kimmel made jokes about making Trump a powerless king, but he meant what he said about getting Trump out of office.
Desperate times call for desperate measures, and I'm asking you, the people who supported Donald Trump, to step in and help for the good of this country. Mike Pence is ready. He's boring. He's relatively sane. He looks like a neighbor you might borrow a lawnmower from. Let's get him in there before it's too late. Let's make America Great Britain again.
Now, if you've picked up your Sunday paper, you've seen that the papers are filled with cries for change. This is the Los Angeles Times, the liberal editorial board there saying enough is enough. Trump is, quote, a danger to the Constitution, a threat to our democratic institutions. Now, all this brings me back to those questions that are tough to ask out loud on national television. Is the President of the United States suffering from some sort of illness? Is he racist? Is he fit to be commander-in-chief? And one more. Is it time for objective journalists, and I don't mean opinion folks, I mean down-the-middle journalists, to address these questions head-on? And if so, how in the world should they do that? The famed investigative journalist Carl Bernstein says yes, these questions should be asked. He's joining us today along with acclaimed presidential historian Douglas Brinkley and Alice Stewart, the Emmy-winning former news anchor and former communications director for Ted Cruz's campaign. Carl, first to you, because you've been asking about the president's stability for quite some time. What is it that you think reporters should be doing to tackle this very uncomfortable subject?
I've been raising questions as a journalist about the fact that Republicans in Congress, the highest of intelligence officials, the highest of military officers in our country, leaders of the business community, all of whom have dealt with the White House, and many of them dealt personally with Donald Trump, have come to believe that he is unfit for the presidency. That's what I'm learning as a reporter talking to many, many people in Washington who over the last month or two have come to that conclusion. And especially among Republicans in Congress, they have been raising the very question of his stability and his mental fitness to be president of the United States. This is not me, Carl Bernstein, saying this. This is me, Carl Bernstein, being a reporter. And what I have advocated and said, it is a important, crucial, dangerous story that reporters need to start making their business to do the reporting, to go to all the Republican members of Congress and talk to them in private or on the record, if they will, about what they believe to be the fitness or unfitness of Donald Trump to be president of the United States.
But when reporters do that, they usually get a no comment, right? They usually get a no comment. How do we get to this issue if GOP leaders won't talk about it?
First of all, I think that you're not going to get too many people who will do what Bob Corker did on the record and question the president's stability, but let's find out. But I think the first task is to remember that most of the good reporting, real deep reporting, investigative reporting we do, does involve anonymity for our sources. And we need to know that people don't have an axe to grind. I don't think we ought to be talking to Democrats about this question. Primarily, we need to go to the Republicans in Congress. We need to go to the top intelligence officials, military officials, and ask them on background, as we call it in our profession, and perhaps off the record, what do they think about the president's stability and fitness to be president of the United States. Because many of those, for weeks and even months that I've been talking to, have openly questioned it. And in the last couple of weeks, it's become a cascade, a torrent, a river of serious questions about whether the president of the United States is fit and stable enough to be president.
So if that's the case, Alice, if what Carl is saying is the case, that there are these folks, these leaders in private who are questioning the president's fitness, isn't that the biggest story in the world right now?
Look, first of all, this is not the first time this question has come up. If you recall back during the campaign last year, Donald Trump himself, candidate Trump, questioned Hillary Clinton's fitness to be president due to her private email. So we've had this question asked many times before. However, from as a previous journalist before I got into politics, if people are raising this question, which we're seeing across the aisle, it is a legitimate story to cover. It is a legitimate question to be asking people because elected officials are raising this issue. However, oftentimes what we're seeing lately is it's a lot of Democrats that are raising this question, and specifically in light of what has happened in the last week with regard to the president's response to Charlottesville. There's a lot of emotion as a result of that. And we're having many Democrats questioning his stability. And of course, as you mentioned, Bob Corker as well. But I think it's really, really important to consider the fact that while we disagree on the issues, when we're talking about someone being unfit, I view this much more as a political issue than a medical issue. Many people disagree with the president's policies. Many people this week have questioned his moral take on some of these issues that we're having this week with regard to racism and hatred. While he did denounce it, some of the moral equivalency he placed on that has raised a lot of questions. But I think it's really important when we're talking about his fitness for office, and there's been questions about the 25th Amendment to the Constitution, whether or not he should be removed for medical reasons. We did have Democrat Adam Schiff on with Jake earlier saying we're way too far away from even considering the possibility of removing him from office. I think if people are raising this question, it's a valid topic for journalists to cover. However, we need to look at this whether it is more of a political difference as opposed to a serious medical problem.
And Douglas Brinkley, when we're talking about these issues, if reporters are trying to pursue some really disturbing questions about the president's fitness for office, aren't many conservatives and many Trump voters going to interpret that as just the press being the opposition trying to subvert their vote?
Well, there's no question, particularly the Trump Republicans are going to look at it that way. But Senator Corker is a real leader among Republicans, and it was very brave of him to step out and really talk about the fact that we have an incompetent president and what does that mean for our country. There are things that can be done right now. I mean, on the medical front, look, we all know he is a neon billboard for, overt narcissism, malignant self-love. We've all known that. And now we're seeing that we're getting the ramifications as a nation of what having a sick man in the White House means. I think the Senate might need to move forward. He is. He's not mentally stable. And we need perhaps the Senate needs to do a censor coming up here. General Kelly is going to have to continue to try to stop him from taking to the mics and dividing our country like he did at Trump Tower. There's got to be some effort to control his tweets, but the government's going to have to run. The White House has to run almost around the president. We saw Nixon with H.R. Haldeman. He would tell Haldeman, go bomb Brookings Institute, Nixon, or go bomb Wounded Knee, and people just started disregarding what Nixon said.